Hi, Angela. Is Greg there?
Yeah.
Yes, in just a moment, but I have a quick question for you. The screen, will you have control over Greg's questions and answers? You'll facilitate the questions and answers at the end, 45 minute? Okay, and then will you have control over the screen and the viewing of his name and his while he's speaking, or do you want me to pin him on my end?
Oh, we had a grid view. We could pin him if you want, but whatever you prefer. You want to switch to speaker view to pin him?
That's why I'm asking, because I'm not sure if you have control over that or if you have screens you want to put behind him. I'm not sure. I'm just asking.
Oh, I think the default settings, everyone can see and interact with each other, and that's how we've been doing it on the other ones. Unless Greg wanted something else, then I think we can just leave it this way. And then everyone can look in the grid view and see each other, which helps with the conversation part.
Okay, so what I think I'll do is I'll pin him while he's speaking, giving his talk.
Great.
And then maybe I'll just take your cue and then we'll just unpin him and do the Valerie cue, the gallery view. So people can interact with him, okay? Or whoever's speaking.
Great, and he's a co-host, so he has the permissions to do any of that on your end too.
Okay, all right. I'll just let you.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we are in our second session. We just had an introduction and some amazing spoken word and a land acknowledgement. And now we're going to have our keynote from Greg Saris, who is a staple at Sonoma State as the Endowed Chair in Native American Studies at Sonoma State. But Dr. Saris is also the chairman of the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria. So last year, the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria were generous enough to take us on a tour of the casino and tell us about some of the projects and activities that they're doing in their social justice work. And Greg Saris gave us a really interesting lecture about some history and contemporary organizing that's happening. As far as some housekeeping today, you can see the ground rules behind me for our discussion. So Dr. Saris will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of interactive Q&A, and we'll ask you to follow the ground rules that are behind me. We also rely on your answering some survey questions to continue putting on Social Justice Week. So Shannon, our student lead, will be facilitating the chat if you have any technical questions, but I just dropped our survey in the chat. We read your feedback every year for Social Justice Week and rely on that for our funding application. So today we are going to have a two-part discussion. The first, we'll hear a summary of the massive amount of social justice work the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria are working on. And then we'll hear a little bit about how people who are in the audience today can support the work. For example, if there's ways to intern or collaborate or do advocacy together. So Greg, I see you on the screen. We'll turn it over to Greg for 45 minutes. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you for having me. Let's see, can you get me on the screen? Mm-hmm. All right, everybody, tilt it a little this way. There. Okay, there we go. This darn Zoom, we keep getting it. It's a little difficult. Oops, Angela, could you get the whole head a little bit more? Perfect. All right. Welcome, everybody. Sonoma State University Social Justice Week. First of all, I'm honored to be asked to give the opening address here. And I just want to thank the Sonoma State folks who organized this week and welcome all the students, staff, and faculty who are listening. I can't think of anything in so many ways that is more important. Folks, we don't have much time. We've got to get it right. And I'm talking about social justice and environmental justice, environmental stewardship. They're connected, they go together, and we can't have one without another. If you think we're having issues now at the southern border, Imagine what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years when there's no more snow in the Andes and there's no water, and you have 200 million people looking for a place to go. What are we going to do? How are we going to think about these things? What discussions that we're having today are really not necessary? What discussions are necessary? How do we think about one another? How do we get along? Is the big question. So to begin the talk, what I want to do is just go back a little bit and talk about my people. You know, we were here, the Coast Miwok and Pomo, for, we know, at least 10,000 years, but we never say that. We were here from when Coyote created us. We've been here since time immemorial. People always ask me, oh, did your people come down the Bering Strait? I said, I don't know, but I have my bearings straight. All right. And so, you know, we get into this who's here first and who's here last and that sort of thing. The real question is, who was here and worked things out in a sustainable way for a long period of time? That's the question that everybody should be asking. And then they should ask, how did they do it? What predicated an understanding and a relationship with the environment that was sustainable for a long period of time? And how might we use those, not just material practices, but spiritual and ethical ways of thinking that enables the kind of practices, material practices? They go together. So one of the things I want to just go back and give you a little bit of sense of where you're sitting today and on the land on which Sonoma State rests. It is the land, as I mentioned, of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. At the time of we never called ourselves, by the way, Southern Pomo or Coast Miwok. Those are ethnographers' names for us. They classified groups of people by language families. For example, Pomo is a Hokan family from the Hokan language family, and Coast Miwok is a Penutian language from the Penutian language family. We never saw ourselves as such. The languages are very different. Within Pomo, there's very different kinds of languages, a great range of languages, say from Spanish to French to Portuguese to Italian. And in the Coast Miwok, there's variations from, let's say, modern English to Old English. But we understood the old people often spoke 10 languages. Some of those would be as different as, depending on the language families, be as different as English is from Cantonese or Urdu. So you had people speaking many different languages living here. There were more people in this area, in Central California, in this area, than anywhere else in the New World at the time of European contact outside of the present site of Mexico City, which was the Aztec capital. So there were more people here seeming to get along. It was a rich environment. And a little bit about the culture. The culture was such that we considered everything sacred, or everything had power, or songs. A little pebble, rocks, birds, everything had something, so that if you disrespected it or misused it in some way, it would come back on you or someone in your family. Likewise, if you violated another person in some ways, that person would have songs. I might be a good person, folks, but if you violated me, my songs or my spirits, the things that I had, might strike your mother or your child dead tomorrow in a stroke. We didn't have organized warfare. You just got poisoned the next day, all right, which the Europeans didn't understand. Now, the ethnographers characterized our cultures as predicated on fear and black magic. No, they were predicated on profound respect. You were always reminded that you weren't the center of the universe, you weren't most powerful, that everything and every part of you was connected to other parts of the animal kingdom, the human kingdom, the spiritual realm. So we had this very kind of complicated relationship. And also just the way the cultures were structured, many people belong to secret cults, the women's grizzly bear cult being among the most powerful. And in order to train and become associated with a lot of these secret culture societies, I might say. My students get upset with the word cult, so we'll just say societies, secret societies. You had to abstain from sex for 7 years, and you had to abstain from meat. And so imagine, folks, what that did. It kept the population down. And it also, because that was during your early years, it also then, if you began to populate too much or cross into other people's territories, you would get poisoned and different things would come back on you. So again, you had a structure that was sustainable and reflected the interconnectedness in the larger world that we are a part of. Well, and I'm being very general here, and I don't want to romanticize an ancient culture because, of course, there were always problems. We're always have been human beings. So there's countless stories of jealousies and that sorts of thing that, of course, happens with all of us as humans. But then, of course, we get contacted by the Spanish. In the late 18th century, early 19th century, we were taken into the missions. Now, the Europeans had a very different belief system, where we believed in an equitable relationship, all things having power. The Europeans centered all power in God above, and then a hierarchy, a great chain of being, the Pope and then the King. And you were to work for the King or the Pope or whomever, and you had the right, you were entitled by God to dominate the earth and other people who, let's say in this case, weren't Christian. So that was the rationale. Now, interestingly enough, the Catholic Church is against slavery. So we might ask ourselves, how in the world did the Spanish and Portuguese, how in the world, as Catholics, did they enslave virtually the entire South and Central America and California and the parts of the Southwest? How did they do that? Well, they used 3 methods that they said didn't enslave people. One, indentured servitude, vagrancy laws, so that if you weren't working or indentured to somebody and you didn't have your papers, let's say, if you weren't documented, you got put in jail. And if you got put in jail or incarcerated, they then did convict leasing where they sold your labor. That's what they used and how they were able to enslave the indigenous world here. And that was throughout the Caribbean. So the Spanish, the Franciscans, when the missions were part of that whole thing, they came up with the soldiers. They were very cruel. The beginning, some of us went into the missions. We were somewhat curious, but then we saw what they were about. And the second wave, as we call, basically from 1800 or so until the missions were secularized in 1834, we were marched together. Different tribes marched into the missions because we were dying in great numbers from disease, from violence to us, from starvation in the missions and so forth. And they for their colonies, they needed to keep getting Indian workers in there. So they kept going further into the Sacramento Valley, further north to march people into the missions. Well, as you know, with the Mexican Revolution, then Spanish California became Mexican California, and we entered in the Ranchero period. And interestingly enough, the Rancheros, former military people military people in the Mexican military, were given large tracts of land. Right here, it was General Vallejo. And in 1834, or early and a little after, he was given a large tract of land. His adobe is right over here on Adobe Road, and he practiced the same thing as the Spanish. So he enslaved us, and the other Mexican rancheros also enslaved us in the same way that the Spanish had before them. We were an opportunity, we were a labor force, and there were small, what they called rancherias outside the fort, or huts where the Indian working force stayed. And then, of course, the Bear Flag Revolution came. I'm giving you a thumbnail sketch here of California history. The Bear Flag Revolution came 1847, where Vallejo was defeated by the United States. And interestingly enough, the first piece of legislation that the first governor of California enacted in 1850 in Monterey, which was then the capital of the state, was called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. And that legalized Indian slavery. And guess who helped that governor design the law? General Vallejo, using the same principles to enslave us: indentured servitude, vagrancy laws, and convict leasing. But California went one step further. They had a nice little, what we might want to call a footnote in there that said, if the Indian parents permitted their children to go with white people and were as workers or whatever, they could, which set loose a wild spree of killing Indian parents and taking the children. That was then compounded by the gold rush and government-financed vigilante groups, where during the gold rush in the 50s, 60s, you could make a living killing Indians, bringing in scalps and hands and fingers. The Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, that 1850 law, was not repealed until 1868, folks, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. So that while other folks, African Americans and others here in California were free to buy land, never mind redlining and all of that, but free to, in some sense, free to, but we were still being sold here on street corners right here in Santa Rosa. All right, that was going on here. And as you may know, we were not given full citizen, no Indians in the United States. The American Indians were not given citizenship until 1924. All right, so that means that an American Indian woman could get raped and she had no recourse in the courts. A man could get beaten, you could take their kids, do whatever, they had no recourse in the courts. It's an ugly kind of thing, but at the same time, this complex, beautiful landscape where there were great herds of elk and pronghorn and butterflies going through the valley here so thick that they blotted out the sun, and birds and incredible wetlands and diversity, they also suffered. Within the first 50 years of Europeans on this land, the water table itself dropped 50 feet. The great herds of elk and pronghorn virtually disappeared. How did they disappear so fast? Just as the buffalo were mass murdered, the Spanish and early Mexican from the Ranchero period would herd the elk and buffalo to the edge of the great redwoods, and the elk and buffalo would never go into the redwoods, excuse me, not buffalo, antelopes, buffalo on the plains, antelopes would not go into the redwoods because that's where the grizzly bears were. And so they just almost corralled them and killed them in mass. The transformation of the landscape as we know it was radical. So that by the 20th century, virtually 5% of original redwoods were left. The elk were gone. The pronghorn were extinct, gone. And the landscape for us was unrecognizable. And today, of the 1,458 enrolled members of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, from those 20,000 at the time of contact, each of us traces our ancestry back to one of 14 survivors. One of 14 survivors, all of whom were women, all of whom were concubines or wives of the early Americans or early Mexican period. It's a genocide untold. People and the land totally transformed. But what happens in colonization, in all colonizing history with indigenous people is, again, folks, predicated on one word: separation. Separation from the land, separation from one another. And when you're separated, you forget. And when you separate and you're separated in many instances, let's face it, because you have no opportunity to be anything otherwise. You can't remember anymore. The landscape was our Bible. Features of the landscape were mnemonic pegs on which we hung our stories and knew who we were. All of a sudden, we're all, Indian and non-Indian, disconnected. Obviously, the Europeans and others came, they were disconnected. They didn't know this landscape at all. And so, of course, what they wanted to do is bring what they understood, which are cattle and farming and all of that, with them, because they couldn't imagine in an instance of cultural contact that they might learn how to live in the new land they are. They were only interested in serving the monarchy. They were serving the King of Spain and getting riches for themselves and obviously for the King of Spain, for the crown, and then of course for the Mexican government. So think in terms of separation, what separation does. It disconnects you from nature. It disconnects us from one another. And disconnection then becomes normal. That's what's horrible. And the way we live today is disconnected. You don't know where do you know what the name of the chicken was, of the chicken you had this morning? You don't know. We're totally disconnected as a people. We don't know. And disconnection has become normal. And it's toxic in the end. It's pathological. It keeps us blind. And it keeps us also sitting on our own tail. And as a consequence of this kind of forgetting of a we philosophy, one of the aspects of colonization always is the resulting nationalism of the colonized. And it's understandable. How are we going to survive except to pit ourselves against the colonizer? So we too then inherit an us-them relationship. And unwittingly, in our defense of ourselves, we do the same thing. Here in California, there was right in this area, there was the Bole Maru or Dream Dance movement that was nationalistic, secrets in winter of 1870, 71, that postulated that all white people were the devil. And you didn't associate with them, you didn't marry them. There, in some instances in this area, there was the infanticide of mixed blood children because they were part of the devil. And again, you see how we get caught into these things because we're disconnected. We don't see, and then disconnection continues, separation continues. All right, let's get back, if we can, a little bit to the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. In the early part of the 20th century, 1910, California had to figure out what to do with all these Indians, of these little rancherias. More people were moving into California. They didn't want to buy land if there was a few survivors, Indians living here and there. So they created the California Indian Rancheria Act, which put in whatever survivors were in a certain area on a small, usually out of the way plot of land. In the case of Grayton, they gave us 15.5 acres, largely uninhabitable, northwest of the town of Sebastopol. And it was in the Redwoods. And the legislation said for the homeless Indians of California, or excuse me, the homeless Indians of Tomales Bay, Bodega Bay, Sebastopol, and the vicinities thereof. Now, anybody on the Indian census, even if you had Coast Miwok or Southern Pomo ancestry, or you had Navajo ancestry, you became a designee for that rancheria and that tribe. And they gave you sovereign rights. De facto nations were created. And that's where you must understand that the situation here is very different from what it was east of the Rockies. Because east of the Rockies, you had large groups of survivors who were put on reservations, i.e. you're familiar with the Galala Sioux, the Navajo, Hopi, and so forth. But here there were handfuls of survivors where, like as in our case, very few survivors. So they just scooped us together and we de facto became nations, but we had the same treaty rights, sovereignty. In 1958, they decided, listen, we don't want to be responsible for all these Indians. Let's do an updated version of the Dawes Act and give them the opportunity to own their land. They'll no longer be Indians. They'll no longer have sovereignty, and we won't have to deal with them. Just give them whatever land they're on. But the bill is called the 1958 California Indian Rancheria Termination Act, said you must do this with consensus of the tribe. Well, in the case of Grayton, they came in the summer of August of 1958. And at that time, the majority of us were harvesting fruit up in Healdsburg and other areas where we were working. There were just a few old men who didn't really understand the ramifications of the law. And unwittingly, they were cheated and signed away the tribe. So when we came back, we found that we no longer were a federally recognized tribe. And we began, it continued to splinter and splinter and splinter, separate and separate and separate and separate. 1992, long story short, I was a young professor at UCLA, and few of the elders up here called me and said, somebody's trying to put a casino down in our territory in Tamaulipas. It's not their area, that's our area. I said, but we have no rights. We had as much rights, we weren't even considered Indians. We had no rights. So what are we going to do? Well, what we did is we scared they had Japanese investors, and the Japanese didn't understand the details or the ramifications of Indian law and so forth. And so, folks, what happened is we were able to scare their Japanese investors away. They feared Indian war and they didn't want to get involved. But what that did is that brought us together. And I'll never forget the afternoon we all came together at a woman's house who just a couple of weeks ago passed away. And we came together at her house with our family albums. And we sat at a table, folks, and we looked in our family, each of our albums, we had each other's relatives and friends there. And we remembered and understood that we were a related tribe, a group of people. And that moment really spurred us to go forward, to get our rights back. Long story short, we wrote a bill that we got through Congress. It was anybody can write a bill. It's a hard thing. Getting it out of the hopper is who you know. I was pretty lucky at the time. I just finished making a movie with Robert Redford, so I had a little bit of push. Certainly no money. I was a professor. Your professors aren't rich. Well, long story short, Clinton was going out of office and Bush was coming in. Had to push. We got a push. And we got the bill through Congress. President Clinton signed it on December 27th, 2000, 2 weeks before he went out of office. And to date, we are the last tribe in the United States of America to be restored by an act of Congress. There's a couple other tribes that have been restored by a determination of the Department of Interior, but that can be, of course, questioned. But an act of Congress, you need another act to undo it. All right, we tried to, but our act said, you have your rights back, you're a tribe again, you're a sovereign nation. We realize we cheated you, but guess what? We're not gonna buy you any land. You're gonna have to figure that out for yourselves. So here we are in wealthy Sonoma and Marin County as our Aboriginal territory with no money, nothing. We tried various things. We were looked into organic food processing and cheese making and so forth. And everybody wanted to work for us, but they didn't want to give us any money for land. They wanted to come on our land so they wouldn't have to pay taxes. So what are we going to do? Well, people began to discuss the casino word. I had never been in a casino. I was an egghead, a scholar, and I kind of had the elitist notion, I admit today, that casinos were kind of déclassé. But again, long story short, got together with my tribal council, our people, and said, if we understood we were in a lucrative location with our proximity to the Bay Area, large population, can we do a casino that would benefit, whose revenue would benefit Indian and non-Indian alike? Can we do fair wages, build it union, run it union? And can we then become a platform for social justice and environmental stewardship? Can we use our money to find ways for this community to reconnect with the earth and one another? That's what we thought. And it sounded antithetical. And it certainly, and the council agreed, my wonderful tribal council agreed, said, we'll take a chance. We'll take a chance. Let's try it. So of course, there was so much opposition, interestingly enough, from a lot of which was from white liberals who, want the land. They want Indians. I love it. They always love Indians when we're defeated. Oh, lo, the poor fallen nature God. Isn't it awful what we've done to them? Whip me for being a white person for what I've done to the Indians. And I took their beautiful land, and I love their little baskets that they make in the museums. But God forbid it becomes a question of power or territory, and we're wagon burners again. The flip side, the other stereotype. So I remember when I was writing books and making movies, I was Sonoma County's native son. I come back with a casino, and you've never seen such a hailstorm of hatred, racism, and white liberals and others saying that isn't Indian. Casinos aren't really Indian. Well, my response to that is, since when is Safeway Mormon? I mean, again, people don't want to see us as people in history. We persevered. We took the high road. Against the abuse, the racism, the letters that came to us, the bumper stickers that said "Not here, Tonto," the letters that came that said the only Indian is a dead Indian. Yeah, right here in Sonoma County. In my office on the campus, I got people posted things. And I will say that the administration didn't do much to protect me. They wanted to stay out of it because it was political. Never mind, we'd given them money to endow chairs and other money. They wanted to stay out of it. All right. It bothered me. It hurt me. But we took the high road. So one of my cousins said, "Cousin Greg, I'm so tired of taking the high road. I think I've got a nosebleed." But we kept going. And today, little over 7 years after we've opened the casino, we've kept our word. And we've done more in 7 years than any organization, any business, any individual, all of them put together in the history of this county. We've taken care of our own people. We've turned around an 80% dropout rate to 100% graduate from high school. We're educating over 600, not just Indians in our tribe, but we're using revenue from our casino to create opportunities for all American Indians in Marin and Sonoma counties. After school programs, pairing up with word for word theater for summer theater programs where Indian kids can perform and memorize lines, pairing up with the Bay Area Book Festival. So we put together an anthology of student writings every year where they read at the book festival. We've empowered our people, but at the same time, we've done pretty darn well empowering others. To the local governments, to the city of Rohnert Park and Sonoma County, we have given over $135 million in 7 years. In charitable giving, we have given $40 million to environmental programs and social justice and educational programs. $40 million. We've financed campaigns that support the parks. We've given $5.7 million to the Smithsonian Institute, the Museum of the American Indian, to develop curriculum for the public schools, 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, that will be available in libraries and all public schools, where there'll be 3 strands at each level: a national strand, a state strand, and a local strand, preferably the local strand written by the local Indians in the area. What we're doing is transformative, folks. And there's something else going for, and as you know, we've given the money for the Fairfield Osborne Preserve Learning Center. We pay for the summer bridge programs here. We're proud and happy to do those things: social justice and environmental stewardship, fostering the ways in which we all work together and learn together. But we also are interested in true transformation. Because when you talk about charity, what is the model of charity, folks? Let's connect. Let's make some connections here. One thing is you have many people who give to food banks, give to education, give to programs associated with injustice or poverty. But too often, How did those organizations get their money except by exploiting the environment and impoverishing other people, exploiting labor? So Grayton will not give any money to organizations that take money from any organization, including universities, that depend on income from those who exploit labor or whose business compromises the environment. You must make connections because only that way can it be transformative. And luckily, folks, we have the power. We have the money now so that politicians have an option. Politicians are compromised up the hilt because they say and do one thing. You've got a politician here, you've got a state senator who sings and dances at every nonprofit, but he doesn't vote for overtime for the grape workers, the people in the vineyard. Oh gosh, the liberals love him. People love him, but so do the people who exploit labor in the vineyards. Make a connection, folks. It's so important. If there's going to be transformation, if we're going forward, there has to be and must be a paradigm shift where once again we become decolonized in our minds as a people. And once we're decolonized and not afraid to call out the contradictions, to call out what keeps us from the necessary transformation to help us and you young people see a future, we're going to be doomed. We must be tough. We must call it out. And so in closing, I hope you see the ways in which Grayton is a model. You'll see a lot of news lately. Next Monday, I believe it's NBC Nightline is featuring a segment on Grayton. We just did an enormous pay raise. The minimum pay raise for minimum salary, for non-tipped positions at Grayton is $18.50 an hour. For tip positions, it's $17.50 an hour. That's the minimum. For anybody who's on a salary, they got a 10% increase. And anybody who works here 20 hours or more a week gets the Kaiser Gold Cadillac plan, whereby they pay nothing out of their paycheck for full coverage. They can add a family member for a minimum amount. We feed you, we give you your uniforms, we launder your uniforms, dignity in the workplace. If we believe in dignity and respect, it must start at home. And again, my tribal council, our people have sacrificed and said, we must do this. This is the right thing. We have the opportunity to create a transformative model. And the trickle-down effect is amazing. People can buy homes. People can take care of themselves here. People don't have to struggle. A woman with a child who has a fever at 2 in the morning doesn't have to worry if she's got $200 or $300 to go to an emergency room. She can go in there and flip her Kaiser card from Grayton and do a $10 deductible. That's what needs to happen. And there's ways that that model can be replicated locally, statewide, and nationally. And so once again, I think, folks, I'm proud of what we've done and what we're doing. Nothing's perfect, but we are very much in the groove of transformation for survival. And I entreat you in your lives and the decisions you make about your lives to do the same, to ask yourself, am I doing something that's transformative, that is part of creating a paradigm so that all of us understand respect, justice towards one another and the environment, so that each of us know that in truth, we're not separated from one another. We are one. Thank you, everybody. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Chairman Saris. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat and I'll facilitate your question to Chairman Saris. Okay, first question is from Tanya. You mentioned earlier the changing landscape that colonization had. I know here in California, colonizers banned fire burnings that were critical in keeping our environment stabilized. What are your thoughts on the efforts to bring this practice of cultural burnings back? And this is something that we just had Dr. Tom just put a 3-session workshop together on, and many of us attended that. I've actually been doing prescribed burns myself in training, so I want to know the answer to this question too.
Well, simply put, it's a must. Again, let me just jump back. We knew the environment so intimately and we took care of it so well that, you know, the notion is that we just ran around when in fact we did pruning, we did controlled burning, which burned all the understory, and also provided more grass and fertilizer, nutrition for the grass and for the trees. So controlled burning is a must. And it is the way that I think we can move quickly to clean up and begin to restore the landscape here. Short of controlled burning, we're going to have to get enormous crews out there to clean the understory, to prune up the trees, to take care of the trees. I want to, again, an interesting footnote here. There were 2 laws. The first 2 laws that the Spanish imposed on us was a law against burning. And then again, this shows you the ignorance, or not just ignorance, but that's kind of unfair and cruel, the lack of understanding in a case of cultural contact. When the Spanish came and saw us burning in the hills and doing all the controlled burning, and we did it quite, continuously often, they thought we were burning the grasses and the understory because we wanted to starve their cattle and horses. They didn't understand why we were doing it. So the first 2 laws that they passed against us were a law against burning and a law against bathing. They didn't like nudity. We took care of ourselves, sweated, and they put clothes on us that brought diseases, as you know, even at a greater extent. So clothes and burning, and of course, but to answer the question, we must find ways to do that. But it's going to have to be large, and we're going to have to have tracts of land. One of the things the tribe is working on is and we have a model here at Tole Lake, very close to the campus, where we're co-managing the public lands. And we want to do that with the state, but we have it with the local parks. But we want to co-manage the state parks and ultimately the national park, Point Reyes. And if tribes are put in a position, talk to Deb Holland about this, great Deb Holland. If the tribes are put in a position to co-manage open tracts of land, then we can begin to implement large controlled burning projects and others to take care of the land. So it's a long way around to say it's a must.
Yeah, Diana asked in the chat to hear more about Point Reyes and Tule elk specifically, Diana? Or you mean?
Well, because Chairman Saris just referenced Tole, and I live in Petaluma, so I'm thinking, you know, I know something about that. I'd like to hear more about that, but it made me think about we're seeing more ramping up of the distress of the animals and the elk, perhaps. And I just wondered if you could say something about that and how perhaps we could bring tribal management in and deal with this massive, miserable situation at Point Reyes.
Yeah, it is a horrendous, and it's ironic. I was talking about it all day yesterday, and I talked about this topic this morning. Spent a lot of time on it with folks and our tribal folks and advisors and so forth. Yes, we're very concerned. Remember, the elk were reintroduced. They were a native species. There were great herds of them here. If you want to imagine an Africa savanna of great herds of elks in the hills and the coast and coastal ranges, certainly throughout the valley here. But what happens is the elk are out there, and there's the huge debate going on. It's going to be, and I think that's what you're referencing, about not just the elk, but what's the plan for Point Reyes Regional Park. And as you've seen, there's some controversy about politicians that, again, we're supposed to be environmentalists who perhaps have made deals with the dairies and all this kind of stuff. It's all going crazy. But the tribe's in a good place because federal law requires that on state and public lands, and this is going to get strengthened by Deb Holland, trust me, even before our co-management, we're working towards a co-management plan, but even before that, the parks have to consult with us by federal law. We're federally recognized tribes, must consult with us regarding sacred sites, any human remains or artifacts that are found on any land. That includes the lands that's leased by the dairies, okay? So, and we have an agreement and with them, and that now includes also the elk. The elk is considered a sacred animal, part of our cultural history. So we, will be in a position to consult and work with and advocate for the care and maintenance of the elk. I really can't say more than that, but so, we do know what's going on, and we are in a good position to take care of the elk and the land, and also the larger kind of landscape there. And our agreement with the federal government is broad and sweeping. It's just not an area where the elk are, it's the entire park, the entire landscape. So as it is locally and statewide, we're now looking at Willow Creek and the adjacent properties to co-manage. And wouldn't that be wonderful? And we're imagining not just at Tole Lake, but we're imagining at Willow Creek and at Point Reyes, are people taking schools out there, working with university students to go out there and begin participating in the restoration of the Aboriginal landscapes there. We can never go back to the way things actually were, but we can work towards something that is sustainable for all.
The next question's from Christina. From your perspective, is, quote, voting with your dollar, end quote, the most powerful thing an individual can do?
Voting with your dollar. Simple, again, pretty easy question. Yeah, yes. Not just voting with your dollar, but spending with your dollar. So when you go into a store, check things out. Just recently at the casino, for instance, we had to renew a coffee thing. And God, we do lots of coffee. So the first thing, turn that off. What is that? Turn that off. Turn it off, you guys. Sorry, they're distracting me over here. So not here at the casino, we're looking at, buying products. And now what we're saying is, let's look and make sure it's fair trade. Let's make sure everything we buy and bring in here is fair trade and organic. So we're also growing we have an organic 5-acre organic farm, and so that we're growing vegetables for all of our elders. Then we're going to put it in our team dining room, and then hopefully sell it at cost in low-income neighborhoods. Now, I'll tell you another secret. In the casino, because we're federally regulated, we can't hire undocumented folks. But on our farms and gardens, we can. And just like the wage increase that we've done here, we've really upended the hospitality industry, because they've all had to pay their folks more, right? Their people, their porters, and the people that are changing beds and doing that. They've had to pay them more because we've raised the bar so much. You're going to lose everybody. But guess what? When we start doing our large organic gardens and farms, which are just beginning now, my dream, and it's no secret, is to undermine. We can use undocumented people there. We can then have an impact on the vineyards that exploit them. So that's where we're going. That's my next plan of attack with my dollar.
Shannon asks, I'm curious about the education and literacy programs you mentioned. Do all Sonoma County school districts benefit? And do any of the programs teach native languages?
You mean, are you referencing the programs that we're working with the Smithsonian, the Museum of the American Indian, or locally? Here, what we're doing, our Indian folks, Indian kids, we have programs here in our offices and during summer and those kinds of things that we do. And we here are doing and revitalizing our languages. In fact, our young people are speaking it a lot better than some of us older folks. But the literacy program, that we have, and we've given quite a bit of money to our literacy program here, we're now instituting classes in the casino, because we have many, there's like almost 30 different languages in the casino. And the other things I haven't talked about is the cultural differences. And I love the fact we're undoing all the binary crap that have been associated with casinos, the gender role stuff. I am so proud to say that we have transgender beverage servers. You're not supposed to say cocktail waitresses anymore. I got corrected. It's beverage servers. So we're undoing all of that. And so what we are doing here is want to create Spanish to English classes, English to Spanish classes, but we are instituting a literacy class so that all people can understand and read labels. You folks forget that so many people that have come here have a hard time reading. Imagine if you can't read labels on things that you're using. It's so important that people are literate in order to work and have options in their life. So we're doing that. The other thing, anybody who's with us who has a green card, we sit them down in the office, we fill out the paperwork, and we pay for all the paperwork to get them to finish their citizenship, every one of them. We sit them down right in the office and do that. And of course, we've given lots of money. I believe we just gave $250,000 to secure family funds to protect the undocumented and the DACA students. And we've given, I think, a couple $100,000 before that. So we're really putting our money, we're using our dollar to do, I believe, the right thing for all people.
Great. So we have 10 minutes left. I imagine we'll be able to take a couple more questions. Mary asks, do you have recommendations of actions that SSU could take either institution-wide or in individual classes to support decolonization efforts?
Well, I think knowledge is the big thing. And I teach a class, maybe some of my students every spring, and I'm going to keep teaching or have something to do with it on local California Indian history and culture, just so we can, again, make connections. But I think the biggest thing is to believe, to stay awake, to keep your eyes open and to watch and to look for those kinds of programs. We hire a lot of people at our office from Sonoma State as tutors, as counselors, as summer camp counselors. It's a wonderful experience. We'll be hiring people in our gardens. And so there is quite a bit of things that you can do with us. Always check with the tribe. But I think in your own life, folks, young people, remember, more than ever now, we need you. We need you to make connections, to work towards decolonizing your mind, to question. This life that you've been given is not a dress rehearsal. It's the only show you've got. So get out there and kick ass. You got to. Question what you hear. Respect one another and be careful you don't get caught in the us, them, hate paradigm. Try to ask when you encounter difference, why or how. And that would be my advice. But knowledge is the great opener of the vision. And it's all around you. And a lot of times you may feel, well, much of this is impossible. And especially as an older person, sometimes myself and a lot of my friends feel defeated. But two things, as I tell, again, my students, if we're all lemmings going over a cliff, we still have two choices, folks. One, we can drop with the rest as they go. Or two, we can scream as we go and say, hey, there's another way. I choose to be a screamer. Join me and scream. Also, listen, each day we get up, the sun is up. It's an opportunity to embrace life. Don't let the negative stuff rob you of the day and the beauty of the day and the opportunity for you to scream. Don't stop.
Okay, what I think might be the last question is from Jaden. What efforts can a citizen of the community best support the tribe in social justice capacity?
I think look at some of the work, some of the places where we've given money, some of the organizations. I mean, I'm just looking here at Meals on Wheels in Sonoma County, Redwood Empire Food Bank, Beyond Differences, California Tribal Families Coalitions, Legal Aid of Sonoma County. There's many of these organizations here. Then let's go to the environmental organizations, the Redwood League, the Estuary Institute, Sonoma County Conservation Action. Any political things, join us. But look at what we're doing. And look at some of the jobs that we have available here in our tribal offices, where we are doing lots of these things. We are going to be hiring more people, certainly in our gardening and environmental projects. Our environmental view is twofold. There's two prongs to it. One is organic farming and gardening, and two is restoration of the Aboriginal environment. So we're working towards environmentalism in two distinct but related ways. Obviously, we want to restore what's Aboriginal. The oak trees need a lot of care, but at the same time, we're in a contemporary culture and society where, in fact, we have to learn how to grow food. Here in Sonoma County, this beautiful place, we can grow food and take care of ourselves if we will. Instead of all things, building all those houses across from Sonoma State on farmland. Get out there, and if that keeps up, say no. Plant vegetables to feed people there instead of just building more houses to make more money. And are those houses built by union labor? Question, question, question. Kick ass.
Well, we really appreciate your time. Do folks want to give Chairman Saris a round of applause or say thank you?
Thank you, folks. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being here. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you so
Right,
much.
So I put
Happy to scream as a lemming.
our survey. We rely on you completing the survey for our funding. We're funded through the Institutionally Related Activities Program, and we make changes every year based on your survey, but the link is in the chat. And also, Greg mentioned there's a lot of ways to get involved and get paid for social justice work. We are looking to hire a student to help with Social Justice Week. So if you are that student, you can send an email to henry@sonoma.edu or follow up with me through other means. And we are going to be closing our award nomination process soon. So if you want to nominate someone for an award or enter in our contest, you still have time today. And our next panel is going to be, or our next session is a movie screening on mental health and social justice. We're going to be learning from Malinali Lopez, who's a film producer and Chicano and Latino studies here at Sonoma State, about the Islands of Loneliness, her documentary. So again, thank you, Chairman Saris, and everybody who joined us today. Take some time before the next session to get your needs met, and we'll see you at 5:30 and for the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.